Hello and welcome to Recap Radio. I'm Diego Cupolo, editor-in-chief of Turkey Recap, and this is our live show about Turkish politics and foreign policy. Today I'm talking to Berk Esen, associate professor of political science at Sabancı University in Istanbul. He's also the co-author of the book Türkiye'nin Yeni Rejimi, Rekabetçi Otoriterlik, or in English, Turkey's New Regime, Competitive Authoritarianism. Is that coming out in English anytime soon?
Well, not anytime soon, but my co-authors and I are planning to translate some parts and then update the book so that we can cover what has happened since the March 19 operation against Imamoğlu.
Great. Well, I should say thank you for joining us and glad to have you here. I should be transparent. I consider Berk a friend, and we met way back when in Ankara when we were both young men and unhappy people in Ankara. But now Berk is in Istanbul and much happier, right? I'm still in Ankara.
Yes, I think that would be an accurate depiction.
I have to say, as a father, Ankara is great. As a single man, no. But father, family, great stuff. Maybe one day you'll see what I see in the Başkent. Well, let's get to it. People are joining, so we've got a lot to talk about today. Turkey's opposition is under serious pressure. The Republican People's Party, CHP, is facing mounting judicial investigations that have seen dozens of elected officials detained, arrested, and some critics would say harassed by the legal system. Most prominently, Istanbul Mayor Ekrem Imamoğlu was arrested March 19th, about 3 months ago now. This sparked big protests inside the country and raised questions about the future of Turkey's democracy, which Berk has written a lot about. Imamoğlu is Erdogan's most likely presidential challenger, and he's now facing a long series of trials and a potential ban from politics for various corruption charges, which he denies. I should mention he was in court today. Many expect him to remain in prison indefinitely. This opens a way for Erdogan or his successor in the AKP to retain the presidency. Turkey is supposed to have its next presidential elections in 2028 or earlier if we have snap elections. But by doing this and keeping Imamoğlu in jail at this moment, Erdogan and the AKP are being accused of designing the opposition or picking and choosing who they're going to run against, basically. At the same time, the CHP itself is facing a trial that could invalidate its current structure, raising fears the government may intervene in the management of Turkey's founding political party. Perhaps this could be taking the form of appointing a trustee to oversee the CHP. There's a lot to talk about. Before we start, let me restate this is a live recording with a live audience. We aim to talk about 45 minutes to an hour. I'll start with some broad questions. Listeners are welcome to send their own questions. You can submit questions here on the Substack app, wherever you're watching this. We'll try to answer everything that comes our way. Now, Berk, to start, what are the chances that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is coming back as CHP chair? As listeners and Turkey watchers will know, the CHP Congress trial is on June 30th. It accuses the party of having some kind of dirty dealings and vote buying mechanisms that favored Özgür Özel, who is the current chair of CHP, and the trial may invalidate his chairmanship, which would require a return of the former chair, Kılıçdaroğlu, who is not particularly popular, I would say, with most opposition supporters in Turkey. So what do you expect from that trial process to kick us off?
So if Turkey had rule of law, under normal circumstances, there will be no chance for Kılıçdaroğlu to make a comeback in this sort of manner. He clearly lost the leadership contest in CHP's most recent convention in November 2023. And since then, the CHP leader has, certainly since the March 19 legal operation, CHP leader has gained enormous popularity among opposition voters, began to reach out to different segments of the society. So under normal circumstances, There will be no legal chances for Kılıçdaroğlu to make a comeback. And politically speaking, I think it would have been next to impossible for him to make a comeback. Unfortunately, we're not facing normal conditions. Turkey does not have rule of law. In fact, its democracy collapsed long time ago, and we are witnessing monopolization of power under President Erdogan, and he has particularly began to use the legal mechanisms as a potent partisan instrument to weaken the opposition. And I think lately this case has been a great example of that. So the argument is that in the convention, certain number of delegates, the support of certain number of delegates were bought by Özgür Özel, and that's basically how he managed to defeat Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. Now, these allegations have not been substantiated so far. I have not necessarily seen any hard evidence to really back up these claims. It has been almost 17 months since the CHP organized this convention, and since then there have not been any actually appeals, both within CHP and also to the higher election council, which settles on such matters. And so there should have already been a statute of limitations for opening up such a case. So all of those benchmarks have been passed, and yet a few months ago, a couple of delegates supposedly close to Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, but we still don't know their full allegiances. And particularly the CHP's former mayor of Hatay made this accusation, and a new investigation started. Now, so far, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu has been non-committal. He has not ruled out the possibility of some kind of fraud having taken place at the CHP convention. But he has also not really put forward any kind of evidence to suggest that such fraud did take place. He's been fairly silent, non-committal, and said that he's not going to discuss CHP in the courthouse. But in practical terms, that is exactly what has happened and what has been going on. And Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, there was recently, fresh information that came out as part of this investigation that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is considered as the wronged party. So if the CHP leadership loses this case, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu will be reappointed or appointed as the CHP leader because the party's most recent convention will be cancelled. Now, having said that, I still find it to be a very low possibility for Kemal for the courts to make such a decision and appoint Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu as the CHP leader for a number of reasons. One of which is that this would be a colossal political earthquake, which the Turkish economy, given everything that is going on in the region, as well as the ongoing economic downturn, would have a difficulty addressing. But the second point is that there has been very, very limited support, even among opposition voters, even within the CHP base, for a Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu comeback. And as we approach the date of the next court meeting, which is June 30th, pressure is built up on Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu to make a clear statement, an unequivocal statement, to refuse any of these allegations. And so I think the government, watching this process, realizes that this investigation has consolidated the authority of the CHP leadership rather than creating rifts within the party. And the third reason is that even in practical terms, if Kılıçdaroğlu were to be appointed as CHP leader, he would be forced, both politically because of public pressure, but also internally within the party, because probably enough number of delegates would collect signatures to call for an extraordinary convention. So one way or another, Kılıçdaroğlu, even if he's appointed, would need to take the party to a convention right away. And in that convention, I think Özgür Özel will be elected as leader. So I don't really see any kind of major gain for the government. And I don't think that whatever small gains they can attain will outweigh the costs. Having said that, I think the government would be interested in, if possible, delaying this investigation as much as possible. So rather than take a quick decision in the next court meeting, June 30th, postpone it to the next meeting, maybe even the following meeting, so that for weeks, months on end, there would be this ongoing discussion within CHP, creating and widening rifts within the party. And that will only push the party to lose momentum. So I think that seems to be the more likely scenario, although I can't rule out the possibility that the case will end on June 30th, and Kılıçdaroğlu's chances of making a comeback would be completely crushed.
Yeah. And thank you for that. That's a very comprehensive answer. You took away all the questions I would have asked about Kılıçdaroğlu. Since we're talking about Özgür Özel, the current chair, how do you grade his response to date since Imamoğlu's arrest and some of the pressure we've been seeing on CHP? Because, why are we talking about Kılıçdaroğlu? Because he would replace Özel. Would you say that Özel has shown himself to be a new kind of leader for CHP?
Definitely. I mean, I think Özgür Özel has proved to be fairly successful in running the CHP, as well as meeting the pressure coming from the government, especially since the March 19 legal operation that imprisoned Ekrem Imamoğlu and several CHP district mayors and their associates. Since Özgür Özel became the chairman of the party, we've had around 16, 17 months, which is not necessarily a long period by the standards of Turkish politics. Usually, mainstream political leaders running such parties tend to stay in office for a decade, if not longer. So this is still the earlier stages of Özgür Özel leadership. And despite that, he has managed to push CHP to become the largest party in the 2024 local elections. CHP garnered approximately 37.5% of the vote share, which is the highest that the party has seen since 1977. So in 2 generations, no other leader has achieved such a high level of electoral success as Özgür Özel. CHP is currently, both in opinion polls and according to the results of the most recent local elections, the largest party in the country, having surpassed AKP, which is a phenomenal success, of course. Yes, there is an economic downturn. There are major problems within the ruling party ranks, but Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu failed to score a victory in the 2023 presidential election. So this is quite a comeback, a turnaround of the party's prospects. And it's even more impressive since CHP did not establish or form an electoral alliance going into the local elections. And so CHP currently controls numerous municipalities, especially municipalities in larger provinces across the country. And I think it's because of the fact that he has energized the base and increased the level of electoral support for his party, and supported Ekrem Imamoğlu's presidential prospects, that President Erdogan felt the felt compelled to undertake this operation. So it's really from a position of strength that it's really from a position of weakness that Erdogan was forced to take action. This desperate attempt, I shall say. Now, since the March 19 legal operation, I think Özgür Özel's leadership has been quite impressive. It's not easy to withstand this kind of coercion, pressure coming from a ruling party. At that time, at a period in international politics when not just countries in the global south, but even liberal democracies are experiencing democratic erosion and autocratization processes. There's conflict in Middle East, and so all of these international factors have played into the hands of Erdogan to make this power grab. So the conditions are not necessarily going in favor of CHP, and yet it managed to withstand that pressure. That is not to suggest that the legal operations or or these investigations stopped. They do continue. So far, we've had 6 different waves of arrests since March 19th. But after each one of these operations, Özgür Özel managed to lift up the spirits of the CHP voters, many of whom were demoralized, managed to hold rallies. So since the beginning of this legal operation, CHP has been organizing rallies, 2 rallies per week, one in an Anatolian province, another in a district of Istanbul. Millions of people have participated to these protests one way or another. So the party's resolve continues. And Özgür Özel has also, as a young politician who's only 50 years old, demonstrated enormous vitality and energy and dynamism, which is a clear contrast to Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's lackluster leadership. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, by the time that he lost the leadership, was, I think, 75 years old, was not really physically capable of really organizing so many rallies. But even going beyond that, I think Özgür Özel also changed the party's strategy. Under Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, the CHP's goal was to form opposition alliances and basically persuade other opposition elites in order to increase the party's vote share and increase support for the party's joint presidential candidate. Whereas CHP, under the leadership of Özgür Özel, have taken to the streets, have followed the strategy of popular mobilization and directly challenging the government. Now, that's not an easy feat. It requires stamina, it requires organizational capacity, which, by the way, CHP may not have, at least in some parts of the country, where the party's vote share does not go beyond 10 or 15%. And yet, he kept up that effort. So overall, I would give him 8.5, maybe even 9 out of 10 so far. Now, he still faces a number of hurdles that he would need to overcome if Turkish democracy were to be saved and the opposition were to win an election a victory against President Erdogan. He needs to be able to really monitor this process of amending the constitution, which I think would give even more powers to President Erdogan. That's going to be a challenging task, both for Erdogan, whose ruling coalition has only 330 some seats in the parliament. He needs to get it up to 360 to amend the constitution with a referendum, or 400 without a referendum. That's not easy. But for Özgür Özel, whose party has around 130 some MPs, he would need to at least get 200 MPs behind that effort to prevent constitutional amendments. So we're going to see that as a major hurdle. I think this ongoing negotiation process with Abdullah Öcalan, which has a very strong international component, is going to be a difficult challenge for Özgür Özel, because he needs to make sure that that process is not used to strengthen Erdogan and consolidate this authoritarian regime. But at the same time, Özgür Özel needs to be careful of not alienating Kurdish voters, not conveying the impression that his party is against democratic solution to the Kurdish question, and of course getting Ekrem Imamoğlu out, getting the CHP politicians out of prison. That whole legal battle, that is going to be probably the most difficult of the hurdles he would need to overcome.
Yeah, and we'll get back to the PKK Öcalan discussion. Before that, I wanted to just finish up on the CHP's response to the arrests and the grassroots and party-led protests that have been happening. I'm just wondering, one of the main questions I get is, what's the CHP going to do next? Are they going to continue these weekly rallies? And then what does that mean during the summer when it's very hot and maybe people are in different places and they can't organize in the same way that they might be able to organize in the spring or fall, right? What do you make of that? And also, my personal question is, what does the CHP need to be doing? Because it is important to have a public presence by gathering people in these conservative strongholds, right? And showing that there is support for this party. But at some point, there needs to be a conversion to action and electoral organization. And I'm wondering what's the CHP going to do next, and what should it do next?
I think the weekly rallies will continue. I have not really heard or read any reports suggesting that CHP is planning to stop these rallies. And I think Özgür Özel went on the record to suggest that he wants to continue and that he's going to tour the country and he's going to hold rallies in every district of Istanbul. And, you've been following his rallies. He's a fairly articulate speaker. And certainly has a strong campaign presence. He's a very effective, powerful speaker at these rallies. And so these rallies are emboldening CHP, keeping up the party's resolve vis-a-vis this legal operation against Ekrem İmamoğlu and his associates. But it's also helping Özgür Özel build up his leadership. Because his leadership was really under dispute after the convention. Yes, he defeated Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, but Kılıçdaroğlu had a very strong base within the party. And, thanks to these rallies, I think he has energized the party base and strengthened his leadership. So I see no reason for him to stop these rallies. You're right. During summertime, it's going to be a bit more difficult to continue to organize these rallies. They may hold them in the evenings when the temperature is a bit cooler, but I think it's going to continue. Now, these rallies are having some positive effects for the party, not only because CHP has begun to pick some of these conservative provinces as the spots for these rallies, and by mobilizing large crowds in otherwise AKP strongholds, it's having a psychological impact. But I think in these provinces, it's also helping CHP increase its organizational capacity. So most recently, CHP organized a rally in Bayburt, where both historically and in the contemporary period, CHP has very minimal political presence. I think in the last election, CHP got less than 10% of the vote share in Bayburt. So to be able to mobilize thousands of people, even if some of them are coming from nearby districts and provinces, still is an important accomplishment. And some of these people will probably go to the CHP organization. They will meet CHP local politicians, and that builds up the party's local base, which I think CHP needs. Because during the first rallies that took place in the immediate aftermath of the legal operation against Ekrem İmamoğlu, CHP managed to organize massive rallies in Istanbul. But immediately afterwards, it realized that it has minimal presence in Anatolia. That the rallies being held in Anatolian provinces were not as active, as lively, as populous as the ones taking place in Istanbul. So then the party decided to go with an alternative course. But having said that, I think CHP would need to go beyond these rallies to be able to mobilize voters and create pressure for early elections to take place. I think CHP need to come up with more innovative tactics, right? So there are other ways of bringing people together. There are other political activities, more innovative ones, more creative ones that I think CHP need to take into consideration. I think CHP local chapters need to become a lot more active. So during the primary process, so in the immediate aftermath of Ekrem İmamoğlu's arrests and leading up to that, CHP decided to hold a primary to elect its presidential candidate with Ekrem İmamoğlu as the only candidate. And thanks to that primary process, which, by the way, is a first in Turkish political history, CHP managed to add approximately 250,000 new members. out of 1.5 million. So that is quite a huge jump. And I think CHP continues to add new members. So what will the party do with these new members? Will they be incorporated into the CHP local grassroots operations? Will they become active members? Will they be trained, educated, become socialized? I think there needs to be more focus on local party building, which CHP really failed to do under Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, or Deniz Baykal for that matter, Kılıçdaroğlu's predecessor. Another step that needs to be taken, and Özgür Özel suggested that he might be on his way to take such an action, at least in this investigation against the CHP convention. The CHP leadership need to begin to say they don't recognize some of these outrageously partisan and unfair legal decisions. So what happens on June 30th if the courts decide to appoint Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu as the CHP leader and cancel the party's last convention? Özgür Özel said that he's not going to recognize that result. What does that entail? I think the party leadership needs to substantiate that claim. And if it has power to not recognize such a decision, then we should see that in some of the other decisions being taken. Other kind of spontaneous mobilizations should take place. Some pro-government media venues attack journalists, tarnish their reputation, attack politicians. There needs to be a popular demonstration, for instance, in front of these venues, boycott of some sort, right? Economic boycott, in particular. This was demanded by especially young protesters at the Saraçhane rallies in the immediate aftermath of the illegal operation against Ekrem Imamoğlu. CHP joined the economic boycott for a day and then did not continue it. Maybe as a weapon of last resort at some point, that needs to be used. So new innovative tactics that would hurt the government and increase the cost of repression against opposition forces in general and the main opposition party in particular.
And you're in a university. You're around young people. How do you gauge their political activism and willingness to maybe make some sacrifices for a politician that they might support? Because it is risky times. Many people are getting detained. You could get kicked out of school. There are costs to activism, right? So where do you put students' resolve, because they were essential in initiating the protests that we saw after Imamoğlu's arrest?
I mean, from personal experience, I can only talk about university students in Istanbul and Ankara because, as you pointed out earlier, these are the two cities where I recently lived and worked and interacted with university students, and I'm familiar with campus politics. Now, these are the country's most populous and most advanced two provinces, and there, I think the political resolve of the university students is fairly high. Because these students realize that they face terrible job prospects. After they graduate from college, there's nepotism. The economic conditions are pretty bad and worsening, and there's really no hope to change this, other than the fact that CHP may at some point put forward a popular presidential candidate such as Ekrem İmamoğlu, who may win the election. And so when the regime decided to go after Ekrem İmamoğlu, university students, especially in these two cities, took it as a signal that President Erdogan was trying to undermine what is left of Turkey's election institutions and to make a mockery of the electoral process, such that next time Turkish voters go to the ballot boxes, there will not be a meaningful option, and Erdogan will not be defeated. So they had very high resolve, and we see this from the fact that for weeks on end, mobilization on university campuses and by university students continued. Despite growing repression against them, hundreds of university students were taken under custody. Many of them were imprisoned. Some though a rather small number, still in prison. So I think the resolve is there. And because these are young people, they don't always need extensive political organizations to get mobilized. On March 19th, when the legal operation first took place, these students took to the streets even before CHP called them to action. So they don't necessarily need CHP to take the first step, but they do need CHP to further mobilize the rest of the society, to give them political cover, legal support, physical support when they are being harassed, attacked by the police forces. So I think as long as the CHP's assistance and support is there, these students will continue to have the resolve. Now, Turkey, compared to most other Western countries, still has a fairly young population. Now, the birth rates, as you also know, the birth rates are in decline in Turkey. As in fact, there's been a substantial decline over the last 5 years, largely due to political instability and massive economic problems. But Turkey still has a young population, relatively young population. You have hundreds of thousands of people who are either university students or within that age group. Many of them don't face good job prospects, and so they can easily get mobilized. And this is really an part of the electorate that I think Erdogan is going to have extreme difficulty appealing to. Because of his growing age, because of his conservative politics, because of his mismanagement of the economy. So it's important that CHP figure out ways of mobilizing these groups, bringing them under the umbrella of the party, and using the innovative tactics or the innovative potential of these young people for political action. So I think it needs to go both ways.
Yeah, and the obvious way to do that would be campaigning with Immolu, right? He's a popular young politician who's now in jail and facing more trials than I can count on so many charges that it's hard to keep track, honestly. Even when I'm looking on BNet, they try to list all of them and they say there are more. So today he was in trial for insulting a public official, right? And he gave a long statement. I was reading it before we talked. And he said, basically, he reminded us that his social media account is banned. His voice and his image is banned in Istanbul. He used to have many ads around the city as mayor. And it's a nice reminder to see the media imbalance in Turkey, where the state does have a lot of control over official media narratives and what people see. So obviously there are some opposition media that support Imamoğlu and the CHP, but if you are in a public space or in an airport, you see official media, and when they're talking about Imamoğlu, it's often in a very, he is guilty without the trial kind of way. They're showing the money, the stacks of money with his name, with his picture. The corruption is obvious, what do you make of his role from prison? Because he does put out statements, but like, what is the role of the opposition figure, leading opposition figure from prison, in your assessment as a political scientist that writes about this topic often?
Well, I mean, I think the Imamoğlu case is rather unprecedented in Turkish politics, at least since 1950, under a civilian government. Of course, we've had military regimes between 1960 and 1961, 1980 and 1983, during which mainstream political leaders were prosecuted. In fact, a former prime minister was hanged. Several party leaders were prosecuted, some of them imprisoned for several years. So it's not really it's not really the first time that a high level Turkish politician is being prosecuted. But I do not remember of any other time since 1950, since Turkey transitioned to a multi-party parliamentary rule. that under a civilian government, we are seeing such a prosecution. The closest example would be, of course, Selahattin Demirtas, and his prosecution, the prosecution of numerous Kurdish politicians, which of course was a threshold that Turkey passed in 2016, and it was a clear sign that Turkish democracy was no more. But I think this is a new and a higher threshold because Selahattin Demirtas, as popular as he may be, was still the chairman or the co-chairman of a party that was getting around 10% of the vote share, 10, 11 percent of the vote share, whereas Ekrem Imamoğlu is the mayor of Turkey's largest city, is the presidential candidate of the main opposition party, basically the quote unquote the most important opposition politician. And his imprisonment is a clear sign that Erdogan is afraid of losing the next election and is willing to go to great lengths to prevent that outcome. So we don't really have a precedent to compare this case, which is why it's extremely important that Imamoğlu retain his resolve and continues to resist. If you were to throw in the towel, in other words, physically look frail, lose a lot of weight, psychologically does not seem fit, no longer really angry, fighting back, I think it would really dispel the hopes of opposition voters who anticipate that at some point Imamoğlu will come out and will become the opposition's candidate, and they will still prevail in the election. So for me, the most important thing that Imamoğlu can do is to keep his resolve and to come out of that prison in a state that is more or less similar to the state that he was when he went into that prison. So that he doesn't come out having broken, but he also doesn't come out having become a rather bitter and angry person. Because Ekrem Imamoğlu, as his videos demonstrate, has a very high level of EQ, emotional intelligence. Grabbing people, kissing people, talking to them, very loquacious, very, very affable. It's important that he retain those aspects as well. And so far he did. And I think that surprised some regime elites. Because, of course, Ekrem İmamoğlu comes, he's a rich business person. Considering the physical conditions of the prison, it's it's rather difficult for someone who's accustomed to living, living a comfortable life to go through that. It's also quite difficult for a politician who's massively popular to be confined to such a small space and being cut off from people. And so far, he demonstrated his resolve. After that, I think the second point is that Özgür Özel retains his resolve because, Ekrem İmamoğlu is waging a psychological battle to keep his calm demeanor, but at the same time, Özgür Özel is likewise waging his own psychological battle of trying to retain the leadership, keep the party intact, withstand the pressure, defend İmamoğlu and his associates, and continue to hold these rallies while also running the main opposition party, the day-to-day business. And, that's not an easy task. So I think as long as they both keep their resolve and they are both united, in other words, they operate together as a common front, I think opposition voters will remain hopeful of the prospects of change in the next couple of years.
Yeah, thank you for that. Now I'll bring in the peace process. While we're having this crackdown on the opposition, we also have negotiation between the PKK and the Turkish state. Full disclosure, my wife is a member of parliament with Dem Party. So to break it down really briefly, on May 12th, the PKK announced it would dissolve and disarm. Concessions are being discussed right now between Öcalan and the state, and then Dem Party is kind of acting as a spokesperson between the state and lobbying for a central role in parliament and having some kind of commission set up to oversee this process. And we're seeing these negotiations form as CHP is getting wave after wave of detentions. And most people watching this are saying basically AKP and the government is trying to prevent future cooperation between CHP and DEM party, basically dividing the opposition parties, the two largest opposition parties in Turkey. And this move serves to strengthen Erdogan. There's been a lot of debate over whether it's a sincere peace process, whether it's just meant to help Erdogan's ambition to retain power. How do you interpret this kind of split screen we're seeing in Turkey right now, where you have some progress in one area and some really big backsliding on democracy in another area?
I think there's a lot of confusion, even among pundits, analysts, scholars, regarding the true nature and the motivations behind this process. And I think the main reason why many people have been taken by surprise, in fact, baffled by this process, is that at least at the outset, it seems Devlet Bahçeli started it. So the leader of the Turkish Ultra-Nationalist Party, who until recently has been a very vocal opponent of the Kurdish political movement, has of course said very nasty things about Abdullah Öcalan, then had a complete U-turn and appealed to Abdullah Öcalan, invited him to the parliament, even though he's of course imprisoned for life, and started this, at least on paper, started this process. And that took many people by surprise, which is why many pundits still claim that this process started because of external conditions, basically what is going on in the region, particularly collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, the growing Israeli aggression in the region, and Turkey feeling rather vulnerable against Israel, and all of those factors created the need for Turkey to make an opening to the Kurdish movement so that they would be able to somehow bring Syrian Kurds under some kind of an arrangement that will not oppose Turkey. I disagree with this analysis, not completely, but the way that I see it, that's that there are two different processes going on, somewhat parallel to one another and somewhat linked to one another, but ultimately two different processes. The İmralı process, as I call it, is the negotiation process is occurring within Turkey, within the borders of Turkey, involving Turkish political actors. I think that process started much earlier than Devlet Bahçeli's statement, quite possibly around the time of the local election, so around a year ago. And in fact, Tayyip Erdogan has on two previous occasions, 2010s and then again just around 2019 local elections, initiated some kind of a process with Abdullah Öcalan. And I think the goal has been pretty much the same in these first two examples as well as the current İmralı process. Negotiate with Öcalan, make sure that you improve his personal conditions and appease him in exchange for Abdullah Öcalan co-opting the Kurdish political movement and bringing the Kurdish politicians under his watch and by extension under the indirect control of the government. In other words, some kind of a quid pro quo. So improve Öcalan's prison conditions, maybe release some Kurdish political prisoners, prevent, end the practice of kayyum, in other words, government takeover of some of these Kurdish municipalities in exchange for political support from the pro-Kurdish party, DEM party. What that support entails is to be seen. Support for amending the constitution, support for amending the presidential election law so that Erdogan can run for office again and may have easier time winning the election. I don't know, some kind of support in the presidential elections for Erdogan. If not for during the first round, then certainly during the second round. Now, to what extent Kurdish politicians can deliver, to what extent they will agree to these concessions is to be seen, is to be debated. They should not be taken as inevitable developments. I think there will be a lot of discussions there. And the extent of the concessions that the regime can make. The easy ones I already outlined. improving Öcalan's prison conditions, very easy. Ending kayyum practice, but still, I think it'll be easy. Releasing Kurdish political prisoners, most will be easy. Selahattin Demirtas, not so much. But going beyond that, changing the constitution to introduce language rights for Kurdish and some of the other points that the Kurdish movement asks will be difficult, politically difficult. This is the Immolu process. And I think it started irrespective of the international, changes in Middle Eastern politics, and it continues somewhat separated from that international process. However, in Syria, of course, the regime changed. You now have a new government. That new government is trying to co-opt the Syrian Kurdish groups. Trump got elected, and we know that he wants to pull out U.S. troops. The Israelis, since October 7, 2023, have followed and increasingly continue to follow very aggressive policies in the region. And I think all of those factors create an opening for Turkey to lead some kind of negotiation. But these negotiations are not led with Öcalan. Öcalan has no, maybe no would be too strong, but has limited impact on what happens in the international arena. I think there, Erdogan leads high-level talks or negotiations with Trump, with Mohammed bin Salman, with Al-Jalani, the Syrian leader, and probably indirectly with Netanyahu, via Azerbaijan or via Trump. And basically, these leaders are trying to put together a new regional order in the Trump age. And I think what Trump wants to do is to pull U.S. forces out of Middle East, but leave behind some kind of a stable order so that he can pivot towards China. Well, how can stability can be attained? It was lacking for decades, and previous U.S. presidents failed to do. Well, you need to come up with some kind of security assurances to Israel so that Israel will not feel threatened. And so I think in Syria, that is one of the negotiations going on. Well, the Abraham Accords already gave some assurances to Israel. So once Syria joins Abraham Accords, and there is some kind of peace, stability with Turkey, and if the Iranian regime collapses or agrees to not develop nuclear weapons, enough assurances will be given to Israel. Syria would be carved into spheres of influence, south to the Saudis, north to the Turks. But then Turkey needs to be given some security assurances that Syrian Kurds will not pose a threat. And I think Trump has this figured out as the ultimate deal maker, right? What is ironic is that so far, it's Netanyahu and not Erdogan who's breaking this arrangement with Trump, right? Israel is not yet fully on board with the Syria deal. Israel is not yet fully on board with peaceful resolution to the Iranian nuclear problem, and is trying to pull Trump into the more aggressive path. We'll see if Israel will prevail. I think Erdogan is okay. Where there is some kind of dispute is what would be given to the Syrian Kurds. They want, and they have, a de facto autonomy. They want to be able to turn that into de jure autonomy. De jure will be difficult, but then getting rid of de facto autonomy would be difficult for Turkey. So de jure will be difficult for Syrian Kurds, de facto for Turks, for the Turkish side. Some kind of a military arrangement so that Syrian Kurds will not pose a threat. So I think that's where you have some kind of negotiation. Does Erdogan need to hold Immolu talks to be able to lead the international talks? Not really. Does he need this international process to be able to lead the Immolu talks? Not really. Having said that, I think improvements in one type of negotiation may create positive trickle-down effects for the other negotiation. And Erdogan is trying to sort of wager between the two processes, maybe give more autonomy to Syrian Kurds in exchange for the pro-Kurdish party in Turkey going along with Erdogan and supporting him, right? So we may see examples like that, but ultimately these are two different processes. That's why I don't rule out the importance of international developments, but the Imralı negotiations, I mostly see it through the prism of domestic politics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm going to guess you've said this before because you broke it down very clearly. Thank you for that. To start wrapping up, and please send questions if you have them. We just got one on whether Kılıçdaroğlu is compromised or threatened. You're welcome to comment on that if you want. But I'll ask my last question for you, which is Turkey's in a transition, right? I feel like we're going in a direction that the country has not experienced since it became a republic, right? And I'm wondering where we're going because as a journalist, I've been here 10 years in Turkey. I also was here during the Gezi time, 2013. We've been saying democracy is declining in Turkey for a long time. So where are we going? What's going on with Turkish democracy? I have the book on competitive authoritarianism. I checked what's between competitive authoritarianism and autocracy, and there's no steps. So can you help me out here? Like, where's Turkey going right now?
Well, that's an excellent question. Difficult to answer, but let me do my best. But before that, I mean, regarding Kılıçdaroğlu, is he compromised? I mean, possibly. But for me, it's not a matter of whether or not he's compromised. I think it's important to be able to interpret what he's doing and why he's doing it. I think he's a power-hungry politician. He still does not accept the fact that he lost the election. And I think he's surrounded by politicians who are not necessarily very successful, but politicians who are current MPs or former MPs or former mayors who know that only under the Kılıçdaroğlu leadership that they can have political posts in CHP. And I think they are financing his campaign, supporting him, pushing him onto the stage, all in the hopes that either the courts will appoint Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu and then they will be able to return to the party and retain their seats, or the party leadership will be forced to negotiate with Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, and then some of them will be taken back these political positions. Where Turkey is headed is difficult to really answer, but there is one stage between a competitive authoritarianism and full autocracy. So competitive authoritarianism referring to regimes like Turkey, where you have regular elections, but these elections are neither free nor fair. But the opposition still has some viable chances of winning these elections against odds, as we recently saw in the 2024 local elections. That's competitive authoritarianism. Full autocracy is the kind of authoritarian regimes that you have in North Korea, I don't know, Egypt, China, and so on, where you either have no elections, or if the elections you have, they're meaningless, right? Because the incumbent gets 90% of the vote share. In between, you have hegemonic authoritarian regimes, with examples seen in Belarus, Azerbaijan, Russia, Venezuela, where you have regular elections, the opposition is around, opposition may muster around 30-some% of the vote share, but the incumbent clearly wins and dominates, and no one is under any illusion that elections will bring about any kind of meaningful political change. I think that's where Turkey is headed, but that doesn't mean that we are there yet. In terms of how much power Erdogan has amassed, the characteristics of this regime, the level of repression on media, academia, civil society, and now political parties, we are almost there. Sort of like in a hegemonic authoritarian regime. What keeps Turkey still away from that outcome is the vibrancy of the opposition. Both vibrancy of the opposition parties, particularly the main opposition party, which we discussed during this interview, but also the sheer size of the opposition constituencies, representing 40, 45, maybe even 50% of the electors, right? You can't establish an hegemonic authoritarian regime with that kind of opposition support, which is why Erdogan is trying to go after the main opposition party, its most credible candidate, and many of its municipalities. He's not doing this because he's strong. He's doing this because he realizes that the opposition is strong, And if nothing is done, the opposition will be able to win the election. So Erdogan may have a lot of coercive powers at his disposal, but in terms of his legitimacy and popular support, he's at his weakest. And so he's trying to use those enormous coercive powers to be able to gain some popular support and legitimacy. And even if he can't do that, to make sure that the opposition does not gain legitimacy and popular support. So he's going after its candidates, it's going after its municipalities, and it's going after opposition's power bases. Right, trying to make sure that no civil societal organization, media group, or business people will support the opposition. If that process is consummated, then yes, Turkey will be on the verge of, or will get to, an hegemonic authoritarian regime. It's difficult to tell what will happen. I mean, I usually to this kind of question, I give the example of, we're in the middle of we're in the middle of of the sea, on a ship, having met a massive storm. Whether this ship will sink or not is difficult to really know. All we can hope, as Democrats in this country, as opposition voters, is to do our best, keep the ship afloat, because at some point this storm will be over. And when that storm is over, you want to be on the ship rather than in the sea. Now, when the storm will be over comes down to a confluence of factors. Some of it related to international conditions, right? What Trump is doing is, of course, emboldening these kind of authoritarian regimes. So if Trump is weakened, if he loses the midterm elections, if his successor does not win the next presidential elections, then if European democracies survive, then of course international conditions will begin to improve. The state of Turkish economy, which is in very poor state, but it is not in a crisis, and I don't think that it will enter into a crisis, barring some exogenous shock like the war that has just started in Iran, between Iran and Israel. So state of the Turkish economy, and of course what the opposition does. Will it be able to mobilize the masses indefinitely, at least for the next year? Will Immolu keep his resolve? Will CHP remain intact? I think those three factors, I would say, a confluence of those three factors will play a role. I'm by as a character trait, I'm an optimistic person, and I think Turkey will weather that storm. But when, it's anyone's guess.
Thank you so much, Berk. Again, we're talking to Berk Esen. Thank you for everybody who joined. Berk is the co-author of the book Türkiye'nin Yeni Rejimi, Rekabetçi Otoriterlik. Again, that's Turkey's new regime, a competitive authoritarianism. If you missed a part of this show, it's going to be shortly on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, or just visit turkeyrecap.com. You can find the full thing there in a couple of hours. Again, pleasure to talk, Berk, and see you next time. Hope to catch up soon.
Thanks for having me.